I'm author and critic David Agranoff. I'm a horror and science fiction author, critic, and researcher. In this podcast, I wanted to provide in-depth interviews and panel discussions with everyone from New York Times bestselling authors to researchers, musicians, and anyone I find interesting. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. Hello and welcome to another special episode of Postcards from a Dying World. Listen here, this is a return guest, one of my favorites, local. We've had a couple San Diego authors recently, including Casey Griffon and Brian Asman have been on recently. Jim has been here before, but we were talking about one of his nonfiction books. We'll get to Jim in a second. So we've got a whole bunch of new exciting things going on this here podcast too. So I do want to put a shout out if you're new, if you came here for Jim, we are covering all of the stories in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series. I'm about 10 episodes into this, but if you go back in the feed, you can find these are expert panels breaking down these classics of science fiction. So please check those out. And other than that, we've got some, we also have a series that we just recently started, a mini series in this podcast feed on unproduced screenplays. And we've recently done episodes on David Tui's Alien 3 script, Big Trouble in Little China 2. That never got made, and we'll be doing some fun unproduced screenplays in the future. Also, I'm David Agranoff. I am the twice Wonderland Award nominated author of The Last Night to Kill Nazis, and People's Park is my most recent book. So shout out for anyone who checks out those books. Last Night is available nationwide at Barnes and Nobles. You can get it pretty much anywhere books are sold. So on that note, let's talk about the guest of the hour. Jim Ruland was here to talk about his book on SST Records, which is a phenomenal book about the history of one of the weirdest, wildest punk rock record labels of all time. Jim has also co-written a biography with Keith Morris, singer of the Circle Jerks, who he's wearing a sweatshirt for. And he also wrote a biography of Bad Religion. But we're here to talk today about a novel that he has recently written called Make It Stop, which I have right here. Make It Stop was my read on my trip to Astoria, Oregon for BizarroCon 2024. And I started it in the San Diego airport and finished reading it as I was taking the Max trolley across Portland to get brunch with John Shirley. So I had a great experience pretty much reading it in a about 3-hour window. So this is a phenomenal book, and we're going to get into it. Jim, how you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm a little tired. I got back from seeing the Dead Boys at the Tiki Bar in Costa Mesa at around 1:30, and then I didn't just go right to sleep. I had to ease my way into
right. Slumber. What are the Dead Boys like these days? How was that show?
Well, I was there to see a band called El Centro, because of a story I'm writing with the singer Steve Krabby Kabler, about the singer for the LA Times, and it just so happened they were opening for the Dead Boys, and I think just Cheetah Chrome is one of the few original members. I'm not a Dead Boys expert, but they sounded great, and they had a lot of attitude, and they just came out rip roaring and open with Sonic Reducer, and I was like, man, what more could you want? They're just holding nothing back right from the first minute. So I was pleasantly surprised.
Now, in your last appearance, we talked mostly about your SST book, but this time we're going to get into the fiction. And we may repeat ourselves a little bit for people who have seen both episodes. But how did you get into writing fiction? So now we're going to be focusing on this novel, but I mean, you do a lot of writing of all kinds. So, where did the interest in writing come about?
Man, well, I was a really prolific reader as a kid, as I think most writers were, and I was one of those terrible students, but was always reading comic books, science fiction, and a lot of fantasy when I was a kid. And when I got exposed to Dungeons and Dragons, that kind of opened the door to some other pathways that I didn't know about. With some of the monsters and the lore taking me to, into like Elric and the novels by Michael Moorcock, and I must have read 20 or 30 of those, and all the Conan novels, which are not really in the D&D universe, but it's kind of is.
Adjacent, yes.
Uh, Lovecraft, and so then as you do, you just start finding out other things. And one reading experience I had, I went to a Catholic school, and I picked this book off the shelf my parents had. It was called The Lion of Ireland, and it was the history of Brian Boru, and who was this guy, this Irish warrior who defeated the Danes, right?
Mm.
It was like a swashbuckling story, but it was loaded with sex, just saturated with sex. But because it was called The Lion of Ireland and had a hardback, I could bring it to school and read it at lunch at St. James Catholic School. And that was kind of when I got my first subversive thrill from, like, okay, this is kind of cool. Like, they have no idea what I'm reading. There's some wild stuff here being snuck under the radar. So that
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, and I would imagine too, like somewhere in there, punk rock got in there too. And one of the ideals about punk rock that helps us as writers is the kind of DIY attitude that this is the thing you can do. Like, I'm sure that bled into part of it. For writing. So did getting into literature come first or punk rock?
Um, that's, I mean, definitely books because I was around it, and everything. I feel like I'm a slow learner because I was exposed to things, but I didn't really see myself as I think I wanted to be a writer as a kid, but I was a failure as a student. I
Mm.
went to a Catholic school, and I just had a miserable grade point average. I just couldn't bring myself to do the reading. I went to see the Ramones and got into weird music like Devo, but I didn't like shave my head into a mohawk and start breaking bottles. I was still very much trying to follow the rules and trying to fit in, but just not succeeding. And I would say it was, as kind of like a option of last resort, I enlisted in the Navy right out of high school, just to kind of get out of the house, but also to get out from, under the thumb of my parents, which was kind of dumb in retrospect because, what I went from, the harsh discipline of mom and dad right into like the uniform code of military justice of the U.S. military. It was just kind of dumb. And I think I realized that about 10 seconds into boot camp. But I went to boot camp in Great Lakes. I got shipped off to San Diego, and worlds upon worlds opened up. I met all kinds of people who told me what to read and what to listen to, and the adventure began.
And where did you grow up initially?
Um, Falls Church, Virginia. In
Virginia. Okay. Yeah, I think
Virginia.
I knew that, but yeah. So, and it's a big different world from Southern California. It's a very different place.
Yeah.
Um, and so when in the Navy, you're getting exposed to books and like you're getting this. And I was just reading for research for for something about you. I was reading about U-boats, and I was reading about like how much time the crewmen on the submarines were reading because they had nothing else to do, and how extensive their library was. So you're talking about people outside of the bubble in San Diego, but was there also an influence of being in the Navy and certain books being available?
Oh yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, we cannot talk about U-boats or else we're gonna alienate everyone because I could talk to you about um, naval operations during World War II for like 10 hours.
All
But
right, let's make a plan to have lunch about that sometime here in San Diego. Let's do that.
so on my ship, which was what doesn't matter, on my ship in the forward cruise lounge, which was near where my berthing compartment was, there was a cardboard box on a shelf. And in that box, every so often would appear books. And because I was, there's a lot of boredom, and also because I was frequently in trouble and not allowed to leave the ship, I would go to that box looking for books, and I would just read anything. I read Stephen King. I read Mary Higgins Clark. I read Dean Koontz, but I also read In Cold Blood
Yeah.
and Jack Kerouac's On the Road. And I was reading that while our ship was steaming up to San Francisco, which is like the best time for an 18-year-old man to be reading Jack Kerouac is when you're on a ship on the way to San Francisco. So that reading had, I would say had more of an impact. But I don't think it was, I still didn't really have a sense that it was something that I could do. The Navy is not exactly a nurturing place for
Right.
sensitive, intelligent young people, right? I don't think any of the armed forces are, and I don't think it's really their job. And because I got in a lot of trouble on the beach, I was getting a lot of negative reinforcement. So I just couldn't wait to get out of the Navy and use my benefits to go to college. And I didn't really have any sense of what I wanted to do, just what I didn't want to do. But when I got there, my first English professor, um, maybe it's because I was writing essays about naval operations in the South China Sea and my adventures around the world, but he really responded to the writing. And for the first time, I was like, oh, this might be something I'm good at, which I hadn't heard a whole lot of up to that point.
Mhm. Well, yeah, and certainly, there must have been an eye for the talent because we know where everything went eventually. Did you write fiction first, or did you write the nonfiction? Because the nonfiction has been very successful for you, but I, I'm wondering, like, where did you start with taking writing seriously?
Yeah, I think it was, I mean, I've always written little poems and stories and, um, then I started to think of writing novels and everything, but I really didn't have much luck getting things published until I started writing for punk rock scenes. And
Mhm.
then I had that very regular, and seeing my name in print was always a thrill. It never stops being a thrill. Just got the new issue of Razor Cake when I got home last night, and it's just I always flip to my own story first and let's see the illustration of my name. And it's like, wow, that's so cool. And I've been doing that had that experience 6 times a year for over 20 years now. Um,
Mhm. Oh
so
yeah, I mean, especially the feeling when you get a book in your hands, I think is kind of unmatched because it's
oh
like
yeah,
all the years of work. Like it's not so much the ego as much as the sense of accomplishment. I think that is really, really, really fulfilling in those moments.
you know what?
It,
I think you're absolutely right. And I would, they have authors do those unboxing videos on social media, right, where they unbox a
yeah.
book, and it's performative, and it's it has a purpose. It lets people know, hey, I have a book coming out, and I have it, and soon you can too. but every once in a while you see the real joy slip through in
Yeah.
that it's not just, some marketing thing. Like people are like, holy shit, I wrote a book and here it is. Like, wow.
Yeah. And then they had the experience of going through and finding the typos and being like, damn it.
David is such a
But
killjoy.
I know I can't be. Um, it doesn't happen all the time. I know the unboxing thing is it's a true, like, especially, like you said, that there are certain ones that I know personally, like, even though, like, I may have waited to make sure that I could get it on video so I could do all that, but there's a true feeling behind all the work, when you're doing that. And you know, I've got the contract for the next novel sitting on my shelf, and I could have signed it yesterday. But I'm really taking the moment to really enjoy the feeling of doing that later. You know what I mean? And I
100%, David. Good for you. I mean, writers, we're always, there's like such a delayed response. Like when am I supposed to celebrate? When I sign a contract? Well, now I got to write a book, or when I write the book, but now they have
yeah
someone has to approve it, or when it gets approved, well, now it still has to be revised and go through the copy. I mean, it just, the
yeah you
can,
have to celebrate the steps. I think for sure.
yep, yeah, the can keeps getting kicked down the road, and you're just, but then you'll see it in a bookstore, and you'll just be, I don't know, filled with shame and dread, or I don't know.
Yeah, well, and then there's the whole thing of when it's out in the world and you're just not prepared for some of that. I had a guy come up to me who just by complete coincidence at the Verbatim Book Fair was reading The Last Night to Kill Nazis on the train to San Diego, and didn't know I was going to be there. Just, first time reading any of my books. And then, he's like, wait, that name looks, I know that book. I'm reading that book, right? And then, had that whole experience. And that's, when a book's out in the world, you have no idea, what's going to happen to it either, and but yeah, so you've had all the success with the nonfiction books, and that's been really great. It's been really cool to see. You're telling stories of artists who a lot of times wouldn't get that kind of granular detail and all that. And the SST Records thing, even though it's not my personal favorite record label, um, uh, from that era, or even, but the history of how they did everything was so fascinating to me. So you've done all that, and where along the way did Make It Stop happen as an idea? Is it one that you've been tracking for a long, or been thinking about for a long time, or how did this novel germinate in the beginning? Like, where did the seeds come from? Because you've been writing nonfiction, and you could keep writing nonfiction and probably get good contracts for those, right?
Yep. Um, well, I mean, I don't want to say yeah. I it's hard for any writer to make a
Yeah,
list these days. But yeah, I mean,
but it's more of a guarantee than writing a novel, I'm sure.
yes, yeah, absolutely. There are better prospects and fewer people trying to do it is probably
Yeah.
the best way to do it, the best way to explain it. But I love reading novels, and this idea had been kicking around pretty much since probably as long as I've been writing all three of those punk rock books that we talked about. Um, I had this idea, which is to write a story set in a world where if you don't pay your hospital bills, you don't get to check out, and that there's a underground vigilante group that busts people out of these prison hospitals. And I was like, oh wow, I want to see that movie. I want to read that book. That's, they always say, write the book that you want to read. And I'm like, I thought that was a pretty strong idea, and I set out to write it, and it just didn't match. The outcome didn't match what I envisioned for it. It just wasn't that great. I was like, okay, I need to rethink this. I need to reimagine this. And that went on for years, David.
Yeah. Well, I know. I mean, Ring of Fire, my novel Ring of Fire, I spent 15 years kicking the idea around before I actually found the angle in to write it. So 13 years. That can happen, you know. So I would imagine now part of my story and how I came to choosing to read this one at this time, because it sat on my TBR for a while, was that I heard the New York Times podcast did a story about these for-profit hospitals that are doing exactly what you're talking about. And New York Times did a whole expose on and so and I again had this happen with Ring of Fire, where the summer after it came out in 2018, there was suddenly the entire world was on fire, right? And then everyone's like, "Oh, you're so ahead of the curve." So, Jim, this was our. I mean, you had heard of real case situations like this, or did this start to happen after you were percolating the idea?
Well, I read, I'm terrible with dates, which is not a good thing for someone who writes nonfiction to admit, but I'd have to go back and look. But I read an article in the New York Times about a maternity hospital in Nigeria that was basically doing this to women who had just given birth to their kids. So they give birth to their kids and they'd be like, congratulations, you owe us this much money. Your baby can go, but you can't. And so they really, until you pay your bills. And so it really put a lot of pressure on the family because I mean that those first, hours and days and weeks are so crucial to, for the bonding between a mother and child. And so I was thinking about that. I think I was newly sober and I was like, man, that's horrific. That no way that could happen here. And I was like, or could it? And
Right.
just from, I'm a recovering alcoholic. I should put, since it deals with a lot of addiction issues, make it stop. I should put that out. And I've had experiences during the early parts of my recovery where I won't say I was preyed upon, but there are people out there who are like looking to sell you services like a bed in a sober living home or, trying to make money off of basically the worst time of your life. And once
Mm.
I looking into those stories, I found out it was a lot more widespread and a lot more. There are like some pretty unscrupulous rehab facilities and things like that, but not to the extent that I imagined it in the book again, or so I thought. So when I read the New York Times and posted it on social media a couple weeks ago. So I think the lesson for both of us here is that if you're going to write a story set in the near future, especially a sci-fi or dystopian story set in the near future, you need to get it out pretty quick, or the future will catch up with you fast.
Yeah, I'm dealing with that with the one I'm signing the contract for right now too. So, the thing about Make It Stop that, and I do want to say to people, like the format that I usually follow when covering novels is that we'll talk about it without spoilers for a while, and then I'll give a spoiler warning, and then we'll really get under the hood of this novel, and I'm really excited to talk about your process. But I think we can do this next part without spoilers. You. It sounds like you tried a couple avenues into this story. Did you go down a path of writing a version of it that you didn't end up using, or just a different lead character? You said you worked on it for a while before you cracked it. Can you tell me about that process?
Sure. It was pretty involved with a lot of drafts, and it just the sense that I wasn't nailing it,
Yeah.
that it wasn't good enough. And I mean, it went out on submission.
Mhm.
My agent sent it out, and we had no takers.
Yeah.
And this is, obviously with this is more with like mainstream publishers and bigger indies. Had a few talks with some people, but ultimately just could not get it to where it needed to go. And but even after it had been rejected and I knew I had like other avenues with indie presses, like I didn't just turn around and see, okay, who's next on the list. Like I knew that I still believed in the idea, and I knew that these editors were probably right, that it was somewhat a flawed novel. I mean, granted,
Mm.
it has, maybe there's some limitations because it's full of drug addicts and drunks and the dystopian take and what have you, but um, when I work with editors, I always pride myself on making the most of every opportunity to make something better.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what the main thing that changed in my mind was that instead of like writing what I thought was an important book about healthcare crisis in the United States, I said, okay, like nobody wants this. I'm just going to have fun and make this an entertaining book about a healthcare crisis. And for that, I looked to movies, I looked to screenplays, I adapted it into like a pilot, and then I kept going. I adapted an old version of the novel into an entire season, just so I could see how it would play on screen and realize, oh wow, there's a lot of people just sitting around doing nothing, talking. Like if this is going to be an entertainment vehicle, there needs to be more action, there needs to be more this and that, more drama.
Is
Things
that where
happen.
you came up with the idea of the group who's like busting people out?
No, that was always there. There was just a lot of like people in vans and dark rooms talking to each other rather than, actually doing things. Now there is some of that, but
I was gonna
uh,
say some of the conversations are very good in this book. So,
well,
um,
thank you. So, but like I was just committed to the idea, and I didn't care that there was no like payday at the end of it. I believed in the idea, and I wanted to make it as good as I could, and it took me a
well, and I'm
while.
sure sometimes it was a brain cleanser from working on some of the nonfiction stuff. You know, I'm sure you were. It helps when you're working on the Bad Religion book, but to like I'm hitting a wall for a day, and I spend a day working on my novel, and then go back to the Bad Religion book, for example. You're in a better space to work on that book, right?
That
I'm sure
definitely
that.
happened while writing the SST book during the pandemic with this novel. And
Mhm.
I was trading chapters with another friend who was struggling with a novel that, funnily enough, he had adapted from a screenplay. And after the research was done in the morning and the writing in the afternoon, and like just like you say, after we cooked and played board games at night, I would like read my friend's chapters, and then I work on my own and send them off to him.
That's awesome. Well, and that I think the screenplay thing, that's what Anthony and I did with Nightmare City, and I think that can serve as an amazing outline, you know, for it's not the same kind of storytelling, but you can visualize things in a different way, and it can really help. And by the way, I kind of saw this cinematically, kind of in a weird way. It had like a bit of a, it's not as sarcastic as like let's say a Fight Club, but it has kind of a little bit of a manic energy to it. You know,
Can we talk about Fight Club a little bit?
talk about Fight Club.
Okay, so people of our generation, or maybe people who have of our generation who have seen the movie once, what do they remember about Fight Club?
The twist, probably, or
Well,
uh,
I was gonna say Brad Pitt's abs, but
well, that too. Yeah, I
like
guess I'm thinking writer. I'm thinking writer wise, but I
yes,
don't
you
know.
are.
Most people
Like,
probably do think about Brad Pitt's abs. Yes.
or like the first rule of Fight Club is there is no fight. That's what they remember,
Yeah.
right? But the thing that's what I remembered. And while I was revising it and I watched Fight Club again, and I read the novel, which I'd never done, and then I watched it again. And I was like, holy shit,
There's a
Project
lot of levels to this.
Mayhem. Project Mayhem is amazing. Like, one, where the fuck is Project Mayhem? We certainly need them now.
Yeah.
And two, like that really helped with my own underground vigilante group make it stop.
Yeah. Well, because my comparison, everyone always wants a comparison of what is this book. And I was at BizarroCon and somebody asked me what I read on the way there, and I said, Make It Stop. And I said it's a bit like Fight Club meets A Scanner Darkly about healthcare. It was just how I described it. And personally, I sold probably 3 copies of the book with that explanation when we were all sitting around a table. So, um, but the Fight Club comparison, I think it is a good one. There, it's a very different book from Fight Club, but it has that manic energy, in my opinion, because partially because of Mel as a character, which we'll get more into in spoilers. But um, Fight Club is very much about like masculinity and identity and all those things. And most people would, for example, we had a whole discussion actually at Bizarre kind of about Fight Club about how most people would be surprised to learn that the author who wrote Fight Club is gay, right? And and they shouldn't be, right?
It's such a homoerotic movie.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they shouldn't be, but it's a thing. Especially because of some of the reputation that the movie had. But whatever, they should have seen it. But the fact of the matter is that sometimes these entertainment vehicles have messages, you can lose track of. It sometimes it's more sly. But what I really like about this book is that because our healthcare in this country is insane and it's ridiculous. The rest, we're the only, large industrialized country in the world that doesn't have some kind of like actual like healthcare system. Ours is completely privatized. So in a lot of ways, this novel in a very unique position to say something about healthcare. And I think you know that's one of the things that's really interesting about this book. But like, talk to me about the healthcare angle to this. Like, when you were starting this, like, you knew you were going to be kind of going after like this big important issue in this country, right?
Well, yeah, and also, I mean, there's the healthcare system just fails us so often and so repeatedly that we just expect it.
Yeah.
Even when we have healthcare. Um, I've worked in office jobs for 20 years and always had decent healthcare. And then when I stopped doing that, I would work on. I'm now on my wife's healthcare, and still had problems just because of lapses when you move from job to job, or
Mm.
when you switch coverages, or when your company is updating, switching their carrier. It's just there are just so many problems in so many ways for people to slip through the cracks. And so you say, like, people of means to slip through the cracks, right? Well, what do people of means have? It usually means they have a job and some money, but what they don't have is time, because they're working and they're driving and they don't have time to deal with all this shit. So they get penalties and they get penalized for being late with this and for switching that and not understanding this and for not following up on that and for not knowing to challenge this fee that's completely bogus and bullshit.
Mm.
And I just feel like what's needed in navigating healthcare is just this kind of punk rock refusal to say no. Like, I'm not doing that. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to pay that. You're gonna have to make and just fight back. And
Mm.
so the whole novel is basically, the idea of an underground vigilante group is just a metaphor for that. I mean, whether you've had someone who is, aging parents, going through those things, or end of life scenarios, or addiction, And not to mention the fact that all of us, or 99% of us, are just a car wreck away from going completely bankrupt. Never mind having, our health compromised.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the things that makes this novel such a great piece of work is because it does address in a pretty subtle way, but sometimes subtle, sometimes not so subtle, like a lot of issues that the healthcare system has by finding this one way in with these people. And if people haven't heard the podcast where the people get trapped, sometimes they'll go in on a voluntary, you know, I I know that podcast they talked about a woman in Florida who she just wanted to get her psych meds, like she just wanted to get a new prescription for her psych meds, and then ended up being trapped for months at a time because all of a sudden she didn't have the money to pay for the things that they tacked on and added to the situation. So what's
And
funny, go ahead.
if you ever admit to even having thoughts of, suicidal ideation, then that opens up a whole another bureaucratic can of worms that can utterly wreck your life.
Right. And in the last couple of weeks, I'm sure there was an uptick uh, in people having those thoughts too. And I think one of the things too that you're dealing with an issue that's real, that's an actual thing, but at the same time, this, I think you'll see the term speculative labeled or connected with this book. But are you comfortable with science fiction? Because it's a dystopia, but I feel like this is a light science fiction novel in the sense that uh, a lot of people probably wouldn't market it as science fiction, but I think I'm comfortable suggesting it to people who read science fiction who are looking for science fiction. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. There are some things in it, like some technology, some near future technology that does not exist, or reliance or on technology that is that we don't particularly use in certain ways.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, to get around like phones and computers and things, everybody has a tab, which is just
Yeah.
short for some kind of tablet that doesn't need to be charged. It runs on a much more efficient battery, and I don't want to explain any of it. Just everybody has a tab,
Yeah.
and
No,
once you
it's very subtle and very good world building. You can tell you've read and digested science fiction before. Yeah.
yeah, and then there's some stuff with cars that is a little clunkier because of everything, all the developments in self-driving cars in the last 10 minutes.
Yeah. Right, right, right. Well, yeah, I mean, your job is not to get everything right. Your job, um, there's the famous thing of where um Judy Del Rey wanted Philip K. Dick to change some of the dialogue in Scanner Darkly because she said they're talking like people in the 60s, and he's like, well, it's about the 60s. And he wouldn't change the dialogue because he was like, well, I don't care how they actually talk in the actual future. This is the future of my novel, so I don't care. Right.
Right,
And
right.
so I think Make It Stop is a science fiction novel. That's my point. So and I will promote it as such
Yeah.
when I do my book reviews and this podcast. Okay, is there anything you want to say before we get into spoilers and really start breaking down the story to and that could include promoting other projects you're working on in the near future or things you've got going on?
Um, well, I don't want to take, no, I mean, I don't want to take a big left turn away from the book.
Well, you
You know,
can because we'll get back into spoilers. We'll reset. Did you want to do some reading recommendations? This would be a good time to do it now for people who haven't gotten the book yet.
okay, yeah. So So I'm part of this new anthology of Hanukkah noir called Eight Very Bad Nights, edited by Todd Goldberg, and not really science fiction, but of course it's more. But it's SST related in that my story is based off a murder at a independent record label in 1992 called Sucks to Be You Records, which it's not about SST, but if you were an SST artist, you would feel like it did indeed suck to be you. I also want to recommend a book I recently read, an ARC for Sarah Grand's new collection of stories, Little Mysteries, which are just absolutely mind blowing. I don't know if you know Sarah Grand's work.
No, I'm going to look into her now.
Oh man, her Claire DeWitt series are just endlessly enjoyable. They're dark, they're bleak, they're extremely well written, very fast paced, and it does some really interesting existential sleight of hand. Um, it's not really the world that we live in. It's there's nothing else like it. I'm also reading 19 Claws and a Blackbird, stories by Agustina Bazterrica from Argentina. And she wrote an outstanding novel called Tender is the Flesh.
I have read it. Yep.
And that's really, really well written and really good. These stories are weird, like very, very strange. I feel like right now, another Argentinian, Mariana Enriquez, is getting a lot of love for her short story collection that came out earlier this year. Um, but I feel like these are a lot stranger.
Hmm.
And then a book I'm looking forward to reading is maybe Gabriel Hart, a California writer. He has a new novel called On High at Red Tide, and I don't even really know what it's about, except that it's got some good violent punk rock weirdness in the opening chapter, and so I'm going to go for it.
That sounds cool as well. Um, those are all really good recommendations. I will be adding some books to my Goodreads list for sure. The Gabriel Hart one, I definitely that the cover caught my attention too. That looks pretty cool.
Like,
So anything that you've any articles or anything that you want to send people in the way to before we get into the under the hood with Make It Stop?
no, but I will point out my weekly newsletter is called Message from the Underworld. It's on Substack. I've been doing it for 5 years now, if you can believe it. It comes out every Wednesday, pretty much like clockwork, and that's where I promote, where I put links to things that get published and talk about events where I'm going to be and projects that I'm working on. Yeah, I was working on a novel for a lot of this year, and I've been dropping little notes about that and stuff like that.
Yeah, I've seen a couple of those clues. So at this point, if you have not read Make It Stop, um, go get it.
See you
And
later.
pause this episode and come back because from this point forward, you have been spoiler warned. So, uh, Melanie is kind of our main character for Make It Stop. She's not the only point of view. The point of view switches from time to time. And first of all, thank you for not writing a novel in first person. I am really, really tired of first person as a narrative tool, which because I don't. First of all, I don't like first person, and I think um, most people cheat when they write in first person. And so I just want to put that out there. Second, so Melanie, was she always the main character from the beginning, or she's a character that developed over time?
Always the main character.
Okay. And she has her situation where um she's kind of like she's really good at coming up with these situations to get herself put in these hospitals under these fake aliases so she can get in and get people out. There's some really cool stuff with that. So tell me about coming up with the organization, Make It Stop. Like, what was the how did you develop that? Was that in every version?
Um, yeah, it existed in different forms. And I think that as I got, looking at it more towards entertainment, like during my mom passed away a few years ago and she had a long illness. So when I would go to visit her, the TV was always on and she loved murder television. She loved crime series,
Yeah.
Bones and I don't even remember them all, but you know what I'm talking about. There are these, you know, it's always like a large cast, right? And
Yeah.
different cast members get to be the hero for each episode, but there's always a point where there's like 5 or 6 of them in a room and they're told the crime and they finish each other's sentences and they all like, all right, let's go get them, that kind of thing. And like those were like so entertaining, and like even though I kind of laughed at them, I was like kept watching them. I would get choked up sometimes, because some minor character has some minor moment. I was totally invested. So I stole some of those kind of tactics. Like I don't have them completing each other's sentences, but I got way more into the interpersonal relationship between, like, they're not like an army, like you would see in Aliens. Like well, actually in the new Alien Romulus, there is interpersonal stuff. There's baggage, right? Who slept with
Right.
who's, that kind of stuff. And this was very freeing because, going to AA meetings in the early part of my recovery was always kind of a crapshoot because there was always a lot of drama, which could be very triggering. And I wanted the book to be like that too. I wanted it to be kind of like the people that are your family that keep you sane are also putting you in danger all the time.
And yeah, Doyle's kind of putting Melanie in this danger, but it's the loss of Gary, their team member. Like he's,
Yeah.
his loss is a huge weight in the early chapters of the book. Like, because he's somebody that you get the feeling they all kind of thought he was a little bit invincible. And so I thought that that was a really good narrative hook for showing, kind of changing the dynamic of before Gary is lost. It's kind of like they're riding high because they've had a couple victories and they're doing really, really well. And then that kind of like resets the situation, or at least that's my memory of it. But and
Yeah, well,
go
if
ahead.
you're a punk rocker or spend any time in that community, that you've lost someone, right?
Yeah.
Because extreme personalities doing extreme things, and whether it's violence or drugs or self-harm. I mean, we've all lost people, and it sucks and it's intense. And for a time it feels like it might drag us down too, or barring that will define us forever. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. And I've had probably more than my fair share of those experiences for someone, from a middle class background. I did not experience homelessness. I was never lived in a punk house. I was never like on the edge of danger 24/7. But I've lost a lot of friends in my family and outside of it. And one thing that has always registered as false to me in a lot of these narratives is just the lack of real grief in crime stories and in stories where there's profound loss. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Steph Chaw wrote a detective series about a Korean American detective in contemporary LA in Koreatown named Juniper Song. And in it, it's like a very small, close circle of friends, and she loses one of those friends and is exposed to death for the first time in her life. And in the second novel in that series, she's just a fucking mess. She's borderline alcoholic and needs people to pull her out of it because she's in despair. She's grieving. She's never experienced those things. And it felt so real to finally see that, not just in the whole, haunted police detective by the case from 20 years ago. I mean, not that kind of corny shit, like real grief. So I really wanted, you know, Melanie to, like, from the very beginning, put herself in extreme danger, make some bad decisions that end up saving her life, and then be hit with just this loss after loss after loss.
Right. So the Colony, which is a rehab center that is in LA, sort of near like Inglewood, LAX area is where I kind of got the idea it was. But on page 50, you describe it as she had never, not this is Melanie, she had never been in a rehab like this before, part prison, part homeless shelter, but it was like a punk squat without the punks. I love this explanation, this um, explanation of the Colony. Can you tell me where the concept for this came in?
I mean, that was the Colony is something I struggle with quite a bit because, I wanted her to feel like, well, she's, literally, naked. She gets tossed in naked, and she kind of has to, you know, either through help of people or her own wits, figure her way out. Right. And,
Hmm.
but I also didn't want to, like, terrifically demonize all the other people who were there, who are also other Melanies in their own way. So, so I invented this horrific drug that has catastrophic physical effects that will kind of like make it easier to mark people who are, way far gone and a threat, um, to Melanie and people who are trying to stay, clean and sober. I would say that everything that happened there was, one of the hardest part to write because, I'd been working with this thriller writer who has really recently passed away, and nothing ever came of it. But he told me that when he writes his books, and they're like kind of these quasi-military kind of things with these rich secondary characters, is that he likes to structure his books as a series of raids. And that got my attention. I was like, okay, that's something I can use. There's like a raid in the beginning of the book. There's another one, because like a raid can work both ways, like getting in, but also getting out. And so there are about four of them in the book. One of them is like a memory, and so that big one when she's in the colony and then escapes and then ends up and almost does it and then has to go back, um was really important to get right. I wanted people to be like, what is this hellhole and how can I make sure I never end up in it?
Yeah. Well, and it's funny too because I think some readers might be like, well, would something that's adjacent to the healthcare system like ever get this hellish? And then I'm like, well, have you ever been to any of these places?
Yeah.
Um,
Also,
and
part
it,
of it I should add is that from my own military experience, um because that would definitely, I hadn't really thought about it until just now actually, but here your experience in the military as government property is tied up in your healthcare as well. And there's always a knowledge that if you go around the bend or do something like that's too bad, like you will just be sent to another place, that's within the base ship, within the base, within the branch of the Uniform Code of Military Justice and the military's massive, patriarchal, power structure, that there's another room or another floor or another area where you'll be brought and you won't be able to leave on your own. And there's just something like terrifying about how that is always hanging over you, even if you're a model sailor, which I was not.
Well, and the colony uh, is very well realized within the book. It's one of the strengths for me. You also have one of the technologies that you kind of work with is the True Love, is the kind of the dating app that Melanie uses. I mean, she uses it to date, but she also uses it as a tool to kind of get herself in the situation where she's, because sometimes she has to get herself thrown into these places in order to break people out. And I like how you dealt with how it's training itself to kind of like know what you like. It's one of the science fictional aspects of the book is how this dating app operates. And it was I'm sure early on in the AI discussion when you were writing this, right, is that these things are training themselves to know us,
Well,
right?
yeah, but that's I don't know. I mean, I don't think there's anything science fictional about true love, to tell you the truth. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, yes, there is yeah, now I forgot my own bug. Yeah, there's the part where it kind of reads your use and makes pronouncements about you, which are obviously AI, but it's a truth bot.
Mm-hmm.
But they're like broadcasted for all to see as if like this is who I am in this community, and like, oh my God, the horror of that. Um one of the missteps I made early in the novel is that like when Melanie gets basically soft banished from Make It Stop, and she's told that if she goes, she needs to work on her people skills, and they'll monitor her through this dating app and then they'll invite her back in. Well, that was like several chapters. And with each date its own chapter, and kind of moving the story along, but it was just way too slow. I had to compress all of that into one much shorter period. But what I really like about um, the dating app thing is that it also is, even though it consumes her just like a drug, and she rejects it just like her recovery, there's one good thing about it, which is that even without a phone, without a tab, without access to a computer, all she needs is she can log into that site from anywhere on anyone's device and reach out to people who she knows, which is maybe kind of comforting if you find yourself, deviceless and alone in a foreign place. If you can just find someone's phone, you can log onto their Instagram and ask for help.
Well, and one of the science fictional aspects is the cannabis, and it's funny because when all the dickhead scholars hang out, we have we're working on there was one PKD fan who categorized all of the fake drugs that he created in all of his novels, and so when I got to page 72 and this drug was introduced, I kind of got a little chuckle for me personally, but it's a really creepy drug that you have invented here, and one that you could see getting wide use. It makes people, their bodies stink afterwards when the so-called cannibals. In this scene where Doyle has to identify a body in the morgue is to me one of the most powerful parts of the book. So can you tell me where this drug came from in your mind?
Well, I don't know if you remember, there was the whole horror of the bath salts, which got a lot of attention, like in Vice articles back when Vice was still around.
Yeah.
And there was another one that really got my attention, which was a crocodile. And it was this synthetic drug that, and this has really informed cannabis quite a bit, that was big in the Soviet Union. And what was really evil about it is that you could you can synthesize it yourself through drugs available at over-the-counter pharmacies, which are open 24 hours a day in the former Soviet Republic. So you could cobble these drugs together, make this thing, and I guess the idea is if you take it or smoke it, whatever, it'll great, it'll do whatever, it's still poison. But if you inject it, that's when you really start to do terrible things to your body. And it got the nickname crocodile because of like the scaly rashes and swollen appendages,
So
and
what was the high people were chasing with that thing? Like they
just a opioid.
oh man. Okay.
This is
The
before
straight edge guy has the hardest time understanding this.
right. Well, this is before fentanyl. This is like, and again, this is in the Eastern Bloc where you know you know
Right.
it used to be harder to come by this stuff. Um, not that I'm an expert in any of that, but it was more the fact that you could make it yourself and the horrific things it did to your body, and people still did it, which is kind of like the whole conundrum of addiction. Like
Yeah.
we do things we know we shouldn't, we know are bad for us, and maybe even kill us and separate us from everything that we love and everything that we hold dear, and we still do it.
Yikes. Yeah.
So yes, straight edge was a good call on your part, young
Well,
Mr. David.
yeah. Well, Cannabis um create also, creates a situation where uh you can see the cycle that this healthcare unit is getting into where like they're making money hand over foot from the people who are taking it. And so was that always part of the plot of this novel, or is that something that developed as you were writing it?
And I wouldn't develop because like as the novel, I was struggling with it, and some parts were longer and needed to be speed. I needed a ticking clock, right?
Yeah.
And the introduction of cannabis into this system that is becoming increasingly militarized and is now being endorsed by the state of California and can spread to greater networks. Um, this idea of this drug being introduced that's going to cause all this harm just so that um, you know these people can fix it, which is a
Well,
lot, which is basically depending on what degree of the paranoia spectrum you're on, is the entire pharmaceutical industry, right? Like there are people that believe that we have the power to eradicate illness, but it's just we can make a lot more money by treating the symptoms.
so Derek Hansen, the CEO of HealthNet Secure, as a character, is a little mustache twirly, but in all the perfect ways. He's like,
Thank you. I will own that. Yes, he's a little mustache twirly.
yeah. But so this scene where he kind of confronts Melanie is a very powerful part of the book. You know, what kind of distinction do you see, or what parallels do you see between Derek Hansen as the CEO of this company, and then that brings him together with Melanie in this scene? Like, what are they trying? What are you needing them to confront in each other?
Well, that's a great question. I think if I was writing this book again, I might have like the CEO be like this bland, vanilla, completely morally corrupt, evil person. But early on in the drafting, I just kind of imagined the young Gary Oldman as Derek Hansen, and it just kind of, I couldn't get the vision out. So he was always a little on edge, a little off the rail, right? Someone who's with an explosive temper.
Yeah,
It was definitely something I could relate to when I was in the throes of my
yeah,
addiction.
Gary Oldman in The Professional is definitely one of the best unhinged villains of all time. So.
Yeah, so that's thank you for the reference. That's exactly what I was thinking about. I don't know what imaginary drug he's doing, but going back to that, I mean, I love imaginary drugs in movies and books because there's a part of me, even though I'm 15 years sober, I'm like, wow, I wonder what that's like. I'd love to do that. And I can indulge that thought for the 30 seconds or so because it's make believe. It's not a real drug.
Yeah,
I'm not gonna go look for it on the internet.
yeah.
Um,
Have you
so
read Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldridge, PKD's anti-drug masterpiece? In my opinion, better than Scanner Darkly.
I have not read that one.
Well, you'll have to.
All right.
It's a book that not everyone gets the first time. It's kind of like, you know, when you saw Mulholland Drive the first time, you're like, what just happened? And then by the time you figure it out, you feel stupid because it's so obvious.
Mm.
That's kind of the experience that people have with Three Stigmata. But
Maybe I should watch Mulholland Drive again because now I feel kind of stupid right now listening to your comment. So
oh, have you not figured out what Mulholland
well,
Drive is doing yet?
let's not talk about it. Let's keep that let's keep that a spoiler free moment of our conversations.
Yeah, well, you go back and watch it. You'll get it this time.
I'm
I
in the
promise.
middle. I'm in the middle of a David Lynch rewatch, so I don't. I want to. We'll have lunch.
We'll revisit that. So, so now we talked about this a little bit before, and as a Dickian, of course, I have to ask because there are some similarities thematically to Scanner Darkly, especially the closing coda parts of Scanner Darkly. And you said you reread it when you were revising this book, or you read it when you were revising this book. Can you tell me what your experience with that is? And I saved that for spoilers because it's so much about what happens at the end of both books.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I don't. I thought it was really interesting. The it's what you said about wanting to change the dialect away from the 60s lingo.
Mm-hmm.
I understand that impulse because it was kind of a hang up for me. Um, and
Right.
in terms of the ending, I just I think it was just the fact that for Melanie, even though that she's like, you know, Make a Stop is now entered a part of their operation where they don't know it yet, but their enemy knows their next move before they do. And it creates all this paranoia and undermines a lot of the relationships in the group. Um, Kind of like towards, the unraveling in Scanner Darkly. Um, I
Right.
didn't I didn't want like a twist like at the end of that book or at the end
Yeah, and I
of
should say the endings are different. They're not the same. I'm saying thematically they have some similarities. Yeah.
Sure, absolutely. But that whole idea of you know, in the end, I think my book is a little bit more hopeful because Hansen is undone by his greed. Like if he's just patient, his plan is going to work. But because he speeds it up so that he can get more power faster, while for whatever reason, he ends up, everything comes crumbling down, or does it? But point
Mm-hmm.
being, it's his own. He also falls into the trap that so many other.
It's less that make it stop stops him. It's that his own greed burns up his efforts. Like even though he's kind of onto them, and they play a role, right? But
Well, it's kind of like when like a powerhouse football team against like a scrappy underdog, and they just let the underdog keep stick around long enough, and they make some mistakes and shoot themselves in the foot, and at the end, when it's just you know 2 minutes left, and it's just your best moves against ours, and all in only that minute they win. You know,
mm,
kind of that kind of situation.
right. And is when I was talking about the thematic differences, I mean the differences in Scanner Darkly is that the rehab absolutely wins, They're going to be opening rehab centers everywhere.
Yeah.
They're going to be producing this drug on the street, and Bob Arctor is completely lost in it. And it's funny because Phil would always say that he wanted a humane note at the end. Your novel has much more of a humane note
Yeah.
than Scanner Darkly
Well,
in that regard.
let me ask you a question. So I know you read the SST book. Um,
Mm-hmm.
you One of the things I took out of the SST book to make room for some other things was a long review of the novel that Raymond Pettibone's father published, Tiger Tiger, or Tiger 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 Tiger.
Alfred Bester.
Hmm?
Are you talking about the My Stars, My Destination, Alfred Bester?
No, I'm talking about Raymond Pettibone and Greg Ginn's dad.
Oh, he wrote a novel called Tiger Tiger because there's a very famous science fiction novel by Alfred Bester called that was released as My Stars, My Destination, but the original author's title for it was Tiger Tiger.
Well, yeah, from the Blake line in Songs of Innocence, I believe.
Yeah. So that was my confusion because I'm
So,
not
like,
familiar with the Pettibone one, but I'm very familiar with the Bester one. So
well, you might like to read that novel because it has a very similar setup to Through a Scanner Darkly. Um,
interesting.
but then kind of goes into like an almost um Thomas Pynchon like World War II spy novel.
Oh, you've said many things that have sold me on this book already.
I mean,
So
and it's not the greatest book, but where it goes is really interesting.
didn't you mentioned it though in the completed book, right? Like
I mentioned it, but I nerded out and wrote like 5 or 6 pages about the book
I'm
because
positive I added that or I looked for it. I remember now from reading your SST book. Yes, I remember reading about it, but I did not track it down. I need to do that. That
so like
sounds yeah.
so Ginn's dad, who was an English teacher in the South Bay, one may have known Thomas Pynchon. Um, that's kind of a question that we'll have to figure out.
Well, and he wasn't far from where Philip K. Dick was living in that era too.
and
So
where was that?
he lived in Santa Ana
Yeah,
during yeah.
very close.
When he I mean that's why Scanner Darkly takes place in Orange County. I mean he was living in Fullerton when he wrote Scanner Darkly, but yeah. Um I mean he lived the last 10 years of his life in Orange County. So but
Yeah, and Pynchon was living in South LA, right there in the beach cities, Gordita Beach. Um,
mhm.
in the
Well,
middle.
and Phil would sometimes go hang out with like that circle with Harlan Ellison and that crew, although he was mostly a recluse down in his place in Santa Ana by that time, towards the end. But interesting. Well, so okay, now I would agree with you that there is somewhat of a the Hansen pulling his his greed being like leading to the last part of the book is huge and important. Is there anything that I always like to ask people like what was the scene that was the hardest struggle for you to realize on the page, and then what was the easiest one, or what was the easiest like part of the novel for you to capture, the hardest and the easiest parts?
Well, we talked about the hardest part, like the colony and how like everything after the colony, I rewrote multiple times. The beginning of the novel, like her being dropped off at the Moni being dropped off at a hospital and breaking in and raising hell and escaping like way ahead of schedule, which ends up saving her life, but then also puts her in a situation where she realizes that this guy she has feelings for is maybe involved with someone else. Her boss fires her and her best friend has been murdered, all those things. I had all that. So it was all like the last act. And I would say the true love part, what I think was probably the easiest, but also it took a while to get right. And then also balancing, the multiple points of view. Like I wrote another novel before that has multiple points of view, and I was a little leery of it at first because I feel like it's very easy to write a novel on multiple points of view, especially one that has a lot of action, where you get a character in trouble, and then you just move to the next character and, let some of it happen off screen, but then you can also give you time to think about, well, how do they get out of this mess? How do I move the story forward without showing every step along the way? And that can be a really fun and interesting way to get a first draft. But then when you revise it, it is a motherfucker to then get all the balance out all the things and make sure everything's right. And people are saying, know things that they can't know and do things that they can't do. And, the whole butterfly effect.
Yeah, I with Ring of Fire, I had like a cast of the multiple point of views. There was like 6 multiple point of views, and it's all about, it's a kind of an end of the world novel. And I was really proud of the fact that I kept the novel under 350 pages, kept it under 300 pages with that many characters was like one of the tricks that I really wanted to try and pull. I mean, doing multiple characters is tough. You have to kind of come up with a rhythm too when you're going back and forth to different characters. And I think, yeah, and it's one of the things I think you did it very well in here because I didn't, I wasn't conscious of it. I didn't pay attention to it. That's one of the things of like, if I get myself lost in the story, then I know I'm in good hands with the writer. And by the way, as a structuralist, I don't know how much because this was several drafts down the line, if you're an outliner or a pantser, but I generally like books that are structured better. And one of the things I liked about this book is I felt in really good hands with the structure.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, I mean, I don't outline, but I love plot. So,
Yeah.
I think, like I can talk to you about James Joyce. I can talk to you about Thomas Pynchon. I can't talk to you about Philip K. Dick on your level. I'm not there, David. Sorry to disappoint you, but there's a lot of like quote unquote high literary stuff rattling around my head for better or worse. But when it comes to reading a book or watching a movie or a TV show, I'm just there like, what happens next? What happens next? And then what happens? And I'm just thinking about, what that might be or what it could be. And that's not the most sophisticated way to experience a book or a movie or a TV show, but that's just the person who I am. And I think I think that way too when I'm writing. And sometimes I need to push myself and be like, Jim, it's okay. The reader doesn't know how we got on the bus, and if they had the correct fare and if they knew the schedule, just put them on the fucking bus,
Put them on the bus.
or
That's
under
right.
the bus, or under the bus, which maybe.
Yeah. Well, no, I get it. I like to think of those things too, and then every once in a while I'll see examples where I'm like, you know, it doesn't bother me in the end. I mean, and we were talking about the language and Scanner Dark. I just read Henry Kuttner's Fury, which takes place in the 27th century on underseas on Venus. And if you can't acknowledge that the science is just wrong, you're gonna be. I didn't care about the seas on Venus, but the thing that made me laugh the most is there's a scene where they're stealing a briefcase of money, and the guy says there might be a bomb inside the dough. And when he referred to the money as dough, I didn't care about the underseas on Venus, any of that. But when he said the dough thing, it just cracked me up because I was like, that really places it in the 40s.
Yeah, really kind of took you out of the novel a little bit, but
yeah, but that's fine. It's okay.
Yeah,
it's
like
okay.
I read this spring, I read novel by a Polish sci-fi writer. Is it Stanislaw Lem? Do you know his
Yep.
work?
Yep.
Did I get
Yes.
that right?
Some people say it's Leem,
Name?
and it may be, but I accept both. But yes, I'm a fan of Lem or Leem, however you want to say it. Which
What?
one did you read?
The one, the meeting of the whatever International Congress.
Oh yeah, that's a weird one.
It's very strange. There's a million make-believe drugs in it, which drew me to it. Um, it's set in a Hilton, which I think is hilarious. Most of it is in a Hilton.
Yeah, I've read it. Yeah,
Worlds within worlds within worlds, and but a lot of this, when did he write this? In the
70s. Yeah, early 70s. Yeah.
like you said, there's a lot of the science that is just like, okay, this is, you know, we know
Yeah,
better now.
well, and his science was good for the time, but he just yeah.
But
Yeah,
it's like,
he wrote an entire novel called His Master's Voice that I don't recommend to people, but I always use an example of the entire book is basically it's like a SETI type book, but the whole book is basically about how we never figure out how to communicate, right? And like most people would be like, it's like, how do you sell a novel on a fail? It's about the failure to communicate, right? And
hmm.
but it's right in the title. If you know the painting, His Master's Voice, he's told you the end, you know, in it. But it's just it's funny. Liam's interesting. But anyways, back to last question about Make It Stop. Is there more with this world, or are we gonna get these characters again? Um, are you're it sounds like you're working on a novel. I heard you're working on a novel there, somewhere in there.
Yes. I would go back to Melanie. I have an idea for what I would do in, a sequel or a prequel, but involving like probably unscrupulous the cult, some cult like figure in an unscrupulous rehab facility that's maybe less overbearing than health net secure. It's definitely a world I would go back to. I would love to know what Scary Gary was getting up to when he was a young man, for example. But yeah, I've moved on. I've written two novels since then. One I just finished and is a big unholy mess, so I'll be working on that. And then I have another a heist film, a heist novel about four English teachers in 1993 who go on a crime spree in northern Arizona.
Ooh, I that sounds great. I'm totally sold on that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's got all kinds of Wild West lore and stuff in it, and some, one of the English teachers' father was a mysterious pulp novelist who kind of fell off the face of the earth. So that's one of the subplots, and um, little Arizona lore and all that kind of stuff. And I had a blast with that one.
Nice. All right. Jim, it was fantastic talking with you about Make It Stop. I probably will post this episode after I get the book review up. So I might do my book reviews out of order in order to accommodate moving this train along. I read so many books recently, so I've got like Philip Frakazi's Third Rule of Time Travel too. I got to get to, which is the one I read right after yours. But really fantastic stuff. I really enjoyed this one. I really, as far as San Diego authors too, I think this is one that I will be promoting in my attempts to get people to read locally. So, on that note, is there anything else you want to say about Make It Stop before we go?
No, well, two things. One, I want to thank you for reading it. Um, it still feels very close to me. It just came out last year, although we're almost into next year. So
Yeah.
it is definitely I've been trying to focus on finding homes for the next projects, but But you know, if you have like a couple million laying around and you want to make a movie out of Make It Stop, or better yet, a TV show, you should probably do that. Yeah, you should do that.
Yeah, we should do that. We got a whole bunch of ones we want to do, but that one would be great. So, and for my listeners, if you made it this far, we've got um more science fiction hall of fame coming up. I will be slowing down. Everyone should know I will be slowing down some of the progress on the podcast a little bit to do final edits for unfinished PKD is coming up. And I'm also probably going to have to do another draft of the novel I finished last year that will be coming out next year. So there will be details on that too, but it will slow down the progress of the podcast a little bit. I say that, and then I read books and I go, I have to talk to that author, and then I end up doing a bunch of episodes anyways. So I probably won't slow down my pace, but I'm ideally going to. So in the near future, there will be that, and we'll have all kinds of new episodes of Dickheads coming out eventually. Hopefully our hiatus will end soon. We have episodes in the hopper. We just need to get them up online. So we've got Radio Free Album Booth coming up, and in Milton Lumpke territory, which is one of the mainstream novels, and an interview with Linda Castellini, who was with Tim Powers when they picked Phil up from the airport when he moved to Orange County. And we interviewed her, which is interesting. So, because she was just a young college student at Fullerton at the time. So those are all coming up on Dickhead. So check those out. And thank you, Jim, for being here. And I guarantee you, Jim will probably be back in the future for something or another. So thank you for your time, everybody. And I'm so bad at saying goodbye on these things. Later.